preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arthur Cohen, and I have the pleasure this evening of introducing to you Mr. Amos Oz. Before I do so, I would want to make several comments which would seem appropriate both to set the context for his remarks and as well to describe something of the difference between the engaged intellectual, the engaged artist, as he functions within the context of American life and political tradition, and as he is obliged to function faute de mieux in the state of Israel. Ever since the days of Randolph Bourne in the 20s of this country, it has always been a parlous dispute among American intellectuals and littérateurs whether the artist should be engaged in politics. That is to say, whether the opinion of the artist is to be given credence when he enters the sphere of political opinion where traditional view holds only politicians are skilled and therefore unreliable, whereas littérateurs are reliable but unskilled. The assumption is certainly breached in a society in which it is virtually impossible to be neutral. That is to say, the artist does not enjoy any Proustian luxury, and the artist in this case has enjoyed no such luxury. Amos Oz, at the age of 15, joined Kibbutz Hulda, where he is today a teacher. He has all his life been associated with the kibbutz movement. He has fought in each of the wars of independence and defense, and he is as well a distinguished Israeli novelist. His most recent book, Touch the Water, Touch the Wind, will be published this week, if publication, as it is signified as a review in the forthcoming Sunday New York Times. Most particularly, Amos Oz has been involved in what can only be described as a loose and unstructured collaboration with other Israeli intellectuals in attempting to bring the introduction of some note of palliation, temporizing, and adjudication to the enormous dilemma which today faces Israel Jewry in coping with the Palestinian question and the issue of the Arab world about it. There is no question that Mr. Oz will be unsettling to many of you, and it is not for that reason that we have decided upon a somewhat subtle procedure for dealing with your questions, since historically Jews have a habit of presenting each question with an ordained lecture. It would be wise, for the sake of not only the endurance of the speaker, but the patience of the audience, that at the conclusion of Mr. Oz's remarks, there will be a brief 5-minute intermission, during which your questions written upon a 3x5 card, which automatically restricts their length, will be passed by the usher to me, and I, editorial competent that I am from your long years in publishing, will determine which questions to put to Mr. Oz as your surrogate. I'm in that respect a shliach tzibur, but one without partisanship. so that I would appreciate if you would formulate your questions succinctly and without rhetoric, which means succinctly. Without further ado, I have the great pleasure of presenting, on behalf of the Y, Mr. Amos Oz.
Thank you, Arthur. Good evening and shalom to you all. I hope you will be patient with my English, or else I'll have to switch into the most fluent Hebrew, which I can easily do. Let me outline first some of the attitudes toward the Palestinian problem in Zionist ideology right from the beginning, and some of the reflections of the conflict in Hebrew literature right from the beginning of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. Now, this is not going to be a historical description or a historical summing up of the conflict, nor is it going to be a brief history, an instant history of Hebrew literature, modern Hebrew literature. I shall try to outline, to draw a certain repetitive pattern in Hebrew literature in Israel throughout the days of the Zionist project, in order to point out a certain sensitivity, sometimes a very relative sensitivity, which has been there throughout the days of the Jewish community in Palestine and later on in Israel itself. And let me begin with a tiny little fairy tale, not a Jewish fairy tale for a change, an Indian one. It is a story about two Indian fakirs, two Indian monks, who were practicing all sorts of asceticism, crossing India from coast to coast, not on a lecturing tour on behalf of May Breathe, walking all the way, and among other oaths, they took upon themselves the oath of silence. They didn't talk to anyone. They didn't even talk to each other. And one day, as they were walking along a riverside, they heard a woman crying for help. She was drowning in the river. After a momentary hesitation, one of them jumped into the water, rescued the woman, brought her safely to the coast, and they both went on. Not a word was uttered. Days and weeks later, the one who rescued the woman suddenly asked his friend, "Tell me, my friend, do you think that I have committed a sin when I carried this woman on my back?" And the answer was, "Are you still carrying her on her back?" Now, I'm not aiming at some allegorical concept of an original sin committed by Jews or Israelis against the Palestinians. Personally, I don't think there was an original sin altogether. There has been, though, a strange, prolonged silence about the Palestinian problem. A silence loaded perhaps with confusion, perhaps with guilt. And when I say guilt, let me emphasize, I do not at all imply sin. We Jews are great experts on having the agonies of sin without enjoying having the agonies of guilt without enjoying the delights of sin. But for many years, really, as you follow the course of Zionist thought and Zionist ideology, you find this almost embarrassing silence about the very existence of an Arab-Palestinian population in the Promised Land. I would say that in the early days of Zionism, the most popular slogan was the one coined by the late Israel Zangwill, who said that what Zionism was about is a land without a people, for a people without a land. It is a beautiful slogan. It is symmetrical. It is romantic. It has in it the yearning to restore the ancient history of the Jews. And above all, it is simple. It is a simple, self-justifying, self-evident formula. Only trouble with it, of course, is that it was slightly inaccurate. And when I say slightly, I am not being ironical. Originally, the population, the Arab population of Palestine, in the early days of the Zionist enterprise, hardly numbered, 500,000 people. Some villagers, some wandering nomads, no national conscience whatsoever, no Palestinian identity whatsoever, but still the country was not empty. It was not a land without a people. Now, among the very first settlers, Zionist settlers in Palestine, there was a young man from Russia, a pioneer, who came to Palestine as early as 1888. His name was Moshe Smilansky, and he was a very enthusiastic young man and a fine writer. He discovered the Arabs, and he discovered the Arab population of Palestine without any moral difficulties or dilemmas whatsoever. I would say that he discovered them with cheer and delight. He said, well, look, here are our forefathers, really. They must be the descendants, the offsprings of the original Hebrews of the days of the Bible or the Second Temple. Obviously, they were forced into Islam, converted, but this is a minor historical incident. We shall bring them back into the bosom of Judaism, and they shall take us back into their bosom, being a healthy, simple, uncomplicated community, having emotional and traditional links to the land, living simple and peaceful life. They will teach us the lesson. They will help us to cure our galut, our diaspora distortions. All we have to do is intermingle with them, come back to the bosom from which we were uprooted by the Romans or whoever. Moshe Smilansky even assumed the pen name, the Arabic pen name, Hawaja Musa, and wrote several beautiful tales about the marvel, the beauty of the healthy, simple life of Arab villages, setting this life as an ideal for the early Zionist settlers. Now we may, if we so wish, we may smile ironically, bitterly, sadly, at the naivete of this man, at the simplicities of his concept. And still, I am saying that he was way ahead of the official policy and the official ideology of Zionism. He did recognize the existence, the very existence of such a population, and worked out what he regarded as an arresting, a fascinating solution for the problem. About 10 years later, and I'm being very schematic about time, I'm just drawing a very rough scheme. About 10 years later, his attitude became the widespread attitude, the communal attitude of the pioneers of the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration. Those people who came to Palestine in the first 14 or 15 years of this century, mainly from Russia, were Tolstoyans. Some of them indeed were Tolstoyans out of a Dostoevsky novel, but still they were Tolstoyans in concept. They did believe in benevolence. They did believe in a civilizing mission. They did believe in loving kindness. They were out to shower the Arab population of Palestine with lovingly embrace. We'll bring the light into the darkness of the tents of the Arabs. That was the widespread attitude. In a sense, the same attitude as expressed 10 years earlier by Moshe Smilansky, by Hawaja Musa. This Narodnik attitude was literally carried out. There was a tremendous attempt to civilize, to teach a lesson, to make the Arab villagers and Bedouin nomads benefit from the Zionist enterprise, cure diseases, teach modern methods in agriculture, and so on and so forth. Among those Tolstoyans of the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration, there was at least one distinctly Dostoevskian character, and I have in mind the writer Yosef Chaim Brenner, one of the most important and one of the most complicated writers of modern Hebrew literature. He first came to Palestine at about 1912, and at the beginning he shared this narodnik, do-gooders attitude to the Arabs. But toward the end of that decade, one can detect a very strange melody in his fiction, not in his political articles, and that is a very interesting little point. In some of his stories, he seems to forecast a gathering storm, an up-and-coming outburst of Arab violence against the Jews. He even uses the term pogrom in the Promised Land. One of his characters, one of his protagonists, is prophesizing in a gloomy way about this. Now, of course, all his fellows regarded him as a madman. Why on earth should the Arabs apply violence against us? Haven't we brought the light into the darkness of those Arab villages? Haven't we been narodniks? Haven't we gone down to the people and brought them the blessings of civilization and so on and so forth, education, medicine, agriculture, whatever? But as well, we all know, they were wrong, and Brenner was right. In 1921, Palestine witnessed the first outburst of fanatic, bloodthirsty, terrible wave of Arab riots against the first Jewish settlements. This was a real shock to the Jewish community in Palestine at the time. Why on earth? What have we done to deserve it? Probably the only Jew in Palestine who were not taken by surprise was Brenner. He was not surprised, but he was dead. He was one of the first victims of those riots. Reality can afford such coincidences. I mean, if I would have put it in a novel, I would certainly be accused of intriguing. But that's how it happened. Brenner died, and the Jewish community became eventually somewhat more sober about the realities. They still, I believe, missed or misunderstood the depth of the Arab opposition to Zionism. But they became aware of the existence of this opposition. They had their explanation for it. The official Zionist ideology at the time and the official policy of the Zionist leadership was, well, it has to do certainly with British administration. They try to set the Arabs against us. It's a good old rule of separate and rule. The British are plotting, Arab notables are plotting, foreign elements are plotting, neighboring Arab countries are trying to raise the temperatures in Palestine. If only we were left alone with the Arabs, if the British administration will go out of Palestine, we would certainly come to terms with the Arab people in Palestine. The leadership, the Arab leadership, is misled and perhaps misleading, but the people must be on our side. It is a misunderstanding and nothing but a tragic misunderstanding. This assumption was almost general, almost a national consensus in Palestine throughout the 20s, throughout the riots which burst out again in the late 20s, throughout the terrible riots of the mid-60s, or rather 30s I meant, 36 to 39. And still the widespread assumption was that there is a British imperialist plot behind all this. They are setting the Arabs against us. And then on the 30th of May, 1941, the Israeli writer Shai Agnon, Israel's only Nobel Prize winner, published a tiny little allegorical story in a weekend supplement of one of the Palestinian then newspapers. It was a very disturbing story, allegorical, written in a style of a fairy tale, and yet very far-fetching indeed by comparison to the general widespread attitudes in the Jewish community in Palestine at the time. The story is called in Hebrew, Mi Oyev Leohev. Arthur, how would you translate this title?
Enemy to beloved, or
an enemy becomes a friend or a lover even.
Right.
Anyway, it's a story about a pioneer, a Jewish pioneer, who came to Jerusalem and decided to build his home on the rocky, hostile slopes of the Judean hills. So he built himself a little tent, like in those lullaby stories, and went out to plow the land all day, and cheerfully came back at dusk to his little tent to find that the tent was uprooted by a savage storm, a powerful hostile wind. Right, our pioneer is determined. He is not the one to surrender or give grounds. He decides to build a hut. And the story repeats itself. Out he goes, singing enthusiastically, plowing the land all day, comes back in the evening, again returns the savage hostile wind. It destroys the hut, carries it away, and our young man builds a house of Jerusalemite stone. And that's, let me tell you, an appropriate building material, a very solid one. It is there to stay. So he builds a house of stone, a powerful one, with massive, heavy walls and roof. At night, the savage wind comes again, tries hard to shake and destroy the building, but of course the building is there to stay. It's strong enough. And there the story ends. The first-person narrator of the story says, since then, the savage wind turned into a light, almost friendly little breeze, which whips away the sweat from my brow as I come back from my work. It's pleasant. Maybe, he says in the very last line of the story, maybe it even likes me. God knows. Now, if you think of the implications of this little story written back in 1941, you come to realize that Agnon was suggesting that the conflict between Zionists, Jews, on one hand, and the Arab population of Palestine on the other hand, can be decided only through establishing facts which cannot be shaken, facts which are strong enough to survive no matter how powerful the hostile forces are. Mind you, there is no hint of communication, of negotiation, of understanding in this story. Just build a house of stone. In no time, really, in less than 3 or 4 years since the publication of this story, as the 40s were a decade in which very many processes in Jewish history were obviously speeded up and intensified, in no time, this became the widespread attitude, the national consensus of the whole Zionist movement in Palestine and outside Palestine. Let's build a house of stone. Let's gather the strength. Let's show the Arabs and everyone else, for the matter, that we are there to stay. And they will have to accept the established facts, whether they like them or not. There were, of course, different variations of this concept. There was the variation of the Haganah, more moderate. There was a more extreme concept accepted by the right-wing underground organization, the Etzel, the Irgun, and the Lehi, the Stern group. But still there was an overall consensus about the necessity to build a house of stone. And we did. In 1948, when Israel fought for its independence, the Zionist house did prove to be a house of stone. The savage attack launched against Israel on the very day of its creation, not only by Palestinian Arabs, but by all the neighboring countries, the siege, the hostility, the attempt to destroy completely the Zionist enterprise in Palestine failed, and failed in a very clear-cut way. There could be no ambiguities about the dimensions of the Israeli triumph in the 1948 war, and there could be no ambiguities about the tremendous amount of sympathy for Israel all over the world at the time. Perhaps, and this remark I should really put in brackets, perhaps we Jews were spoiled by this short episode of world sympathy, somewhere between 1945, or the 40s, the days of Hitler, and 1967. Perhaps in a sense the condition of alienation and misunderstanding and suspicion against Israel and against anything that is Jewish is altogether maybe just to normal, just back to normal. I don't know. Let's close the brackets here. Anyway, according to the Agnon scenario, and at the time in 1948, according to the scenario accepted by the entire Jewish community of Israel, we have had it. The savage storms, the savage wind failed to destroy the house of stone, and now it has to turn into a friendly breeze. It's just a matter of time. And this indeed was the general attitude in Israel to the conflict throughout the 50s, and perhaps until as late as June 5th, 1967. It will take time, of course. The Arabs will have to recover. Their pride is hurt. It is a difficult change of hearts for them, but things will cool down. Or in a very popular wording in Israel, their eyes will gradually open to see the light. If they are not to become lovers or true friends, at least they will accept the facts. The house of stone is there to stay. Again, there were a few exceptions in Israel, and again, those exceptions, some of those exceptions, were writers and novelists. Now, mind you, perhaps it's time to say that I'm not suggesting that Israeli writers have in them necessarily the heritage of the prophets. I'm not suggesting that they always know the final end or the final way out of the conflict. Basically, both Smilansky, Hawaja Musa, and Brenner, and in a different way, Agnon, proved, from our time's point of view, to be utterly wrong. But still they were one step ahead of the politicians and the ideologists, which is no matter of pride, really, no matter of great pride. It's not very hard to be one step ahead of politicians. And not all of them. Mind you, I'm talking about one or two writers in every generation, and it takes decades to realize who was the one at the time. In any case, let our next guest writer be Samach Yizhar. He is the first Israeli born in the line of writers which I have mentioned. Samach Yizhar is a pen name. His real name is Yizhar Smilansky, and he is no less than a nephew of Moshe Smilansky, the first character in my story this evening. Israel is a small country, and sometimes ideological dramas, literary dramas, political dramas are intermingled with family dramas. Yizhar Smilansky published two novellas very shortly after the War of Independence in 1948. They were accepted with outbursts of rage in Israel because several people interpreted them as strictly political pieces of writing. They have accused Yizhar of almost treachery, anti-Zionism, God knows what else. Practically in these stories, the protagonists, the main characters, are young Israelis, like the author, like Yizhar himself, who are tortured not by the moral dilemma vis-à-vis the Palestinian Arabs, but by a certain contradiction in their own Zionist upbringing, a contradiction which came out and became evident during the fighting. On one hand, they were educated. The protagonists, Yizhar himself, I myself, we were educated to believe in loving kindness, to hate violence whatsoever, to believe in peace between nations, to believe in the powerful Jewish heritage of the word, talk to people, convince them. It is always possible to come to terms. There is a magic power in language, and if you only could talk to people, you could come to terms. On the other hand, Yizhar's protagonists in those two novellas, Yizhar himself, I myself for the matter, were forced to fight, and to fight in a rather tough way, and to fight without being able to afford all sorts of sentimentality about it, to fight for survival, kill or get killed, which is a terrible dilemma. Well, do I have to tell you? Now, the interesting things about those two novellas by Yizhar is not so much what is there in those novellas, but precisely what you don't find in them, what you won't find in those novellas. There is no solution. Unlike his uncle, Moshe Smilansky, unlike Brenner, unlike Agnon, there is no conclusion whatsoever. Yizhar simply takes the conflict as a test case to the ambiguity of human condition in general. And in this respect, Yizhar shows the way to a whole generation of Israeli-born writers and poets. A whole generation, again, is a crude generalization, but as I said, I feel obliged to be somewhat schematic about the literary scene in Israel, which is really much more complicated and interesting than I can present it in this brief outline. Anyway, during the 50s, during the 60s, there is a very strange and, I believe, attractive tendency in Israeli writings, in Israeli poetry, to ascribe a certain dimension of normalcy to the terrible conflict between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. And I should like to stress, I am talking about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. And let's differ this conflict, at least methodically, from the conflict between Israel and the neighboring Arab countries, which is fundamentally a much simpler story. Much simpler story. It doesn't have in it the dimensions of a Greek tragedy, which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has. Anyway, you will find that a strange normalcy is ascribed to this tragic conflict. Normalcy in the sense of, well, we live in a constant state of siege. This is a very intensive experience of something which is valid universally, of a rather general human experience. We are in a state of siege politically, militarily, but in a sense everyone is in a state of siege. Who isn't? We live in uncertainty about the future. Who doesn't? We are facing a certain moral dilemma. Who doesn't? We don't have simple solutions to complicated problems. Who has? We don't really know what's going to happen to us, to each one of us tomorrow morning. Who does? And thus the Israeli condition was captured and presented in this current Israeli literature as a kind of symbol of condition humaine, of the human condition in general. Now again, I'm giving a very unfair description to a variety of attitudes, to a variety of nuances, points of view, literary styles, literary genres. But still, I would say that this phenomena was rather evident, rather clear in the writings of several current Israeli writers. And there was another typical attitude in the works of poets like Yehuda Amichai, writers like Avraham Bet Yehoshua, and I deliberately choose the names of those who were translated into English, Yoram Kaniuk, others who are not less important but haven't been translated into English, unfortunately. They didn't share throughout the 50s and the 60s the widespread optimism about the conflict being on its way to cool down and die down gradually. They didn't share the feeling that the Arabs' eyes will open to see the light. Now, I'm not saying that they have proved to be right or wrong. It is much too early to know where this drama leads and what's the end of it going to be. But I do believe that in a sense, current Israeli writers, as much as they are concerned with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, discover the full dimensions of the tragedy. Now I have repeated this formula, tragedy, dimensions of tragedy, full dimensions of tragedy. Let me depart at this point from the literary instant history of certain aspects in literature and try to explain why do I regard the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a tragedy. Basically, I believe that both Israelis and Palestinians have a case in this conflict. In saying this, I would like to avoid any symmetrical interpretation. I am not suggesting that the two cases, the Israeli case and the Palestinian case, are symmetrical, or even that there is any semblance between the two cases. It's clear enough that the way each party fought for its case, well, there is all the difference in the world, really. In spite of several criticisms which I have against Israeli policies at several points of time, I do believe that basically the Israelis aimed at peace and compromise and understanding. Sometimes they misunderstood what the Arabs stood for. Sometimes they disregarded the agony, the misery of the Arabs. Sometimes they didn't realize what was the source of the trouble. But throughout, they did intend to reach a certain understanding. I can't say that for the Palestinian movement. Not nowadays, and not as far as the early history of the Palestinian movement is concerned. It has been throughout, right from the beginning, one of the most fanatic, uncompromising, extremist national movements in modern history. It stood for a case, it had a case, but it stood for it in a way which, to my understanding, is a savage way. Now, what is the Palestinian case? And I'm not here to advocate it, nor am I here to blame it or to reject it as an irrelevant case. The fact is that while at the early days of Zionism, there was no Palestinian conscience, no Palestinian entity whatsoever. During the history of Zionism, during the Palestinian confrontation with Zionism, they have developed certain attributes of somewhat different entity, different vis-à-vis other Arab countries. Pan-Arabism as a concept proved to be irrelevant to the Palestinians precisely because they were rejected by each and every Arab country. Now we can, of course, divert our moral rage against the Arab countries who behaved so inhumanly against their own so-called brothers. Why couldn't the Egyptians absorb really and settle those refugees? Why couldn't the Syrians? Why couldn't the Arab world with its huge resources, with its huge spaces, with its agricultural lands crying really for people? Well, it doesn't really make a fundamental difference. The Palestinians were rejected. No matter how well off some of them are in Kuwait or in Saudi Arabia or in the Lebanon, they are still regarded as foreigners. They are still, in inverted commas, the Jews of the Arabs. I have a strong feeling, and I'm not going to try to prove it right now because it is a bit of a complicated story and it will involve looking into Palestinian Arab literature. I have a strong feeling that some of this Palestinian identity developed out of a strange love-hate relation toward the Jewish community in Palestine. Secret admiration, hatred, envy, jealousy, the old story. But the fact remains, they have developed certain attributes of community identity. And this identity could not be satisfied in any existing Arab state. We may regret it. We may think that this is a very painful course of events, but it is a matter of fact. And I believe one can be a very good Zionist, a very keen Zionist, or else a reluctant Zionist, a critical Zionist, and still stand up and admit that there is a Palestinian problem, there is a problem of an entity, probably a national entity, which has not been satisfied. Now, what do I mean when I say satisfied? Personally, I think that the entire concept of national states altogether throughout the world is archaic, murderous, irrelevant, inhuman. Personally, I would have wished to live in a world where there are 100 or 200 civilizations and not a single national state. I am not going to put a demonstration for the world. I am not going to be the first one in the world to give up nationhood altogether. As long as anyone else has a lock on his door and bars on his window and defensive system and everything, I'll have it all right. I'm not going to be a pioneer anymore in the sense of internationalism. I'm not going to set an example upon the whole world once again. I can't afford it, not after Auschwitz, and I have children. And that's exactly what turns me into a Zionist in spite of my fundamental reluctance about national states altogether. But let's face it, we live in a crazy world where every Zambia and every Gambia and Congo Kinshasa and Congo Brazzaville and whoever get those nursery toys of nationhood, wave flags, print money notes, issue stamps, play the game. Perhaps it is an epidemic. Perhaps one day several nations or all nations will come to a certain maturity and realize how pointless the whole game is. When it happens, I'll be very happy to be the second one in the world or the third one in the neighborhood to join in. Not the first one for a change. Not the first one for a change. But the Palestinians, at least those Palestinians who regard themselves as Palestinians, are almost the only community on earth nowadays. Almost the last community on earth not to have those so-called toys of nationhood. It is easy enough to be ironical about it, and I've tried it all right in conversations, confrontations, arguments with Palestinians. I was trying the argument, why on earth should you have your own little tiny limited national state in the Gaza Strip in the West Bank? That's ridiculous, it's pointless, it doesn't make any sense. Economically, it will be a nonsense and a nuisance. And still they have an iron argument, an argument which I simply can't turn down. They say it's easy for you to say you have got it, and we haven't. So I personally believe that this need, which is very evident in several Palestinians, I don't know how many. You can't possibly know how deep and large this movement is really among the Palestinians because they never had the opportunity to express themselves politically in any democratic way. Never. Neither a referendum nor any kind of elections under Israeli occupation or in the refugee camps or elsewhere. Still, they will have to satisfy this need for a while. Maybe after 10 years, less than 10 years, more than 10 years. they will realize that it makes sense to have a common market with Israel and other Middle Eastern countries. Maybe in a longer period of time, other more reasonable methods of coexistence would be considered. Confederation, federation, meta-national state whatsoever. I definitely don't believe in the idea of switching straight from enmity, hatred, suspicion, terrible emotions into federation or a United States of Palestine, Israel whatsoever. So far as to the Palestinian legitimate need to satisfy their yearn for attributes of nationhood, or the need of some Palestinians for such satisfaction. The story of the PLO is an entirely different story. The fact that, to me, the PLO at the moment is not negotiable, at the moment, at present time, has to do not with the fact that they have committed so many atrocities. They have committed terrible atrocities. And yet I believe that if it could save a single human life, it's worthwhile talking to the devil himself. I believe that if, hypothetically, in the year 1943 or 44, Hitler would have decided for some reason to let the rest of the European Jewry out of the Nazi empire, Weizmann will go all the way to Berlin and shake hands with the monster and negotiate with him about terms. The idea of talking to murderers is not as that frightful to me as it is to several other people. I'll talk to murderers on one issue and one issue alone: how to stop the killing. But when I say that the PLO is not negotiable, it is not because they are murderers. It is because their ideological aim is not to liberate the Palestinians. Paradoxically enough, they aim at liberating me. And I don't really want to be liberated by anyone. When they come out with this idea of a secular, non-religious, democratic republic in Palestine, I say, who is Arafat to liberate me from, inverted commas, the monstrous yoke of racist, fascist, whatever Zionism? If I ever decide that Zionism is not good for me, I shall liberate myself. I shall find my way. The ideology of the PLO, to me, is as meaningless as would have been a Viet Cong aiming at the liberation of Philadelphia, or a Algerian PLN aiming at liberating Paris or Marseille or whatever. Now, as long as this is the official policy of the PLO, there is nothing to negotiate about. There is no chance and no grounds, really, for compromise between existence and non-existence. There is no such thing as half-existence. There is no such thing as on and off existence. As long as they struggle for a Palestinian state instead of Israel, rather than besides Israel, I can't see any possible potential ground for negotiation. It may change. I don't know. I won't prophesize. I think the best possible scenario which I can think about is perhaps a simultaneous mutual recognition of the PLO by Israel and of Israel by the PLO, and then we'll have to cope with the painful problem of boundaries, territories, guarantees, demilitarization, and I'll be very happy, relatively happy, if we come to this phase when the conflict is not anymore about existence and destruction, but when it becomes a conflict over territories and frontiers. It will be a harsh bargaining. It will take time. It's definitely not going to be a kind of messianic, melodramatic reconciliation, the way some Israelis still have it. An idea taken in the best case out of brothers Karamazov, in the worst case out of Yiddish theater here in New York 50 years ago. If we only could speak to the Arabs and open their eyes to see the light and tell them that we are really good and we aim at their benefit and we want to develop them and we want to enrich them and we want to educate them. If we only could talk to them and tell them this, they will say, oh brothers, what have we done? Now this is out. Conflicts in history usually do not solve through a formula, through a magic formula. They sometimes die down out of exhaustion, out of fatigue, out of despair, some kind of despair, partial despair, if at all. And therefore the scenario, which is still the beloved scenario of a few Israelis, fewer and fewer really, the scenario of first let's have a change, a basic change in the Arab emotional attitude, and then perhaps we can talk about peace, is to me a sort of reversed scenario, an upside down scenario. First let's aim at some kind of political settlement, maybe a partial settlement, maybe an interim settlement, maybe the kind of settlement after which both parties leave the conference hall with clenched teeth and say to one another, wait, one day we'll show you. That's not the end of the story. And if we want, our sons and grandsons will show you whose Alsace-Lorraine is really, to whom does it really belong. And then if we get such a vulnerable formula, there might develop an atmosphere of a gradual emotional de-escalation. That's the best I can think about. I wish I had a magic formula, a prophetic formula, a redeeming formula. We Jews will always go for the absolute. Either give us peace which is an everlasting peace once and for all, peace which is secured and guaranteed and we can be absolutely sure that we go for this peace without taking any risk at all, or else it is a catastrophe. It's a second Holocaust. It's an entrapment. It may well be. Even this vulnerable political formula, which I think as a starting point, is very difficult to achieve and definitely impossible to achieve as long as the PLO aims at the disintegration of the State of Israel. And even if we have this interim formula, even if we have this kind of unstable settlement, it is not sure, it is not certain, it is not automatically that we shall be on the road toward what I call gradual emotional de-escalation. But I can't possibly think of anything better than this. I bet, I sense in the air that some of you may have simpler formulas. I want you to believe me that every possible formula has been in me. I have considered it. It is a matter of life and death for me. I have fought 2 wars, and 2 wars are too much. I have my children in Israel. It's no matter of irresponsibility. It's no matter of intellectual speculation. It's no matter of chess strategy. It's a matter of life and death. And this scenario, which I just described to you, is, to my best understanding, the least bad, the least disastrous possible scenario. And let me say I'm somewhat skeptical even about this only scenario which I can think about. I am regarded in Israel as a somewhat strange bird, really. The hawks will take me for a crazy man because I share a good deal of the pessimism of the Israeli hawks. And still I come out with moderate compromising formulas such as simultaneous recognition of the PLO by Israel and of Israel by the PLO. For the doves, I'm a strange creature as well. I mean, here is an Israeli who does not believe, regards himself as a dove, and does not believe that we have got the keys. And if we only do this and that, we'll be on the road to peace. No, we haven't got the keys. And there is something very arrogant in the assumption, which is popular with Israeli doves, really. The assumption that if only we have done this and that, we'll be on the road to peace. Because it regards the Arabs as, this point of view regards the Arabs as in a sense, irrelevant, irresponsible for what they are doing, not realizing where they are, gross material for Israeli strategy. No, war and peace and love and hatred and marriage, really, takes two parties. I mean, you can't possibly do it on your own. And let me stop at this point and expect your questions or oppositions. Thank you.
Some of the questions are extremely good. I've eliminated the ones that are personal. Do you want to talk about Michal Shili and the Arab twins?
Not really.
All right, so that eliminates.
There are very many questions about
No, there are two.
this.
Enough. Here is one that might be of interest. And here is the group that seems, can verbal recognition be enough of an assurance for Israel having That's one version.
Perhaps we'll maybe start with this one.
Has the position of the UN relative to the PLO impeded the Israeli and Palestinian time?
I can deal with this.
Can you explain the Israeli attitude toward Palestinian Arabs during the two wars, 67 and 73? That might be, or is that too difficult?
Well, we'll take a long answer.
Yeah. If the PLO continues along the same lines intransigently, what other way do you see to communicate or begin a settlement in Palestine? What are the initiatives? This is one of the questions that really undercut all of these. This is an interesting one. Do you think that discussing the problem in terms of Greek tragedy plays a paralyzing and damaging myth, facts, a type of symmetry that makes negotiation impossible?
It's an interesting question.
It's an interesting question. Do you want to try that? Then
Let's
there's one
try,
about
say.
Noam Chomsky, about the binational state. And how does one gather the moral courage to not fight in the face of extermination? I think we leave that one.
Right.
So let me take then.
4 or 5.
Yeah.
Please.
All right. Good.
Right, and apologize.
Nice,
Can't
right.
deal with all of them.
If we can begin. The question we have is, can verbal recognition of Israel by the PLO be enough of an assurance for Israel? Haven't verbal agreements been a way for the Arabs to gain time in what would still be the eventual destruction of Israel?
Well, I think the key word in this question is the word assurance. And let me tell you straight away, there is no total and final assurance. We Jews have lived for centuries, millenniums really, in a sense outside history, surrounded by books, in the sphere of the absolute, beyond, above, or below history. What Zionism was all about, or one of the things that Zionism was about, is the idea that we have, perhaps we are sentenced to step into history. Once you step into history, you take risks. Zionism was, has been, is a risk. I am sure that verbal recognition in itself is no assurance. Furthermore, I assure that nothing on earth could assure Israel once and for all against Arab aggression or other aggression. And therefore, I am aiming at a political solution rather than a metaphysical, messianic solution. I would take reasonable risks. Now, I could, of course, go into details and tell you my own ideas about demilitarizations and guarantees and securities beyond the verbal recognition. But I think this is unnecessary precisely because there are so many different versions in Israel itself about those necessary guarantees. But let me make it very clear. I'd never regard verbal recognition as an assurance. I will regard verbal recognition as a launching pad, as a point of beginning. It must be accompanied by other military, political, and economical guarantees.
Another question, which is certainly to the point, and I had it here. Oh, it fell here. The one that fell on the floor. Thank you. To what extent do you look upon the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine, in Israel, as a cultural clash, with the Arabs rejecting an essentially European culture, precisely because it is European, and the Jews seeking to impose a European culture and civilization upon Palestine, and thereby essentially irreconcilable?
Essentially irreconcilable is again one of those, to my understanding, non-historical, meta-historical expressions. In politics, in history, nothing is essentially irreconcilable. But I would say that there is more than just cultural conflict in it. I would say that both sides, in very different ways, are haunted by the neurotic shadows of their pasts, their historical pasts. Haunted to that point that very often they fail to recognize the actual opponent. To be more precise about it, for very many Arabs, Palestinians and non-Palestinians, we are indeed nothing but an extension of the white, sophisticated, colonizing, oppressing Europe with which they had a very grim experience. They completely fail to look Israel at the face and see it as it really is. And to my understanding, Israel, in a sense, is a refugee camp, rather than the kind of omnipotent, powerful, sometimes arrogant facade which it tends to present for some reason to the outside world. But this is beyond the Arab understanding altogether. For us, for many of us, the Arabs are nothing but an extension of the cruel, savage Gentile, the Goy, who is out to make a pogrom, to plunder, to rape, to kill, to murder. This is a matter of stereotypes, and only in Marxist mythology, all those who are persecuted are automatically brothers. On a personal level as well as on a national level, the worst possible conflicts are the conflicts between two persecuted individuals or, for the matter, two persecuted communities. Personally, I think that one of the, you mentioned in your introduction, mission of literature, engaged writing, one of the things on which I feel, in a sense, engaged is to remove stereotypes, to bring those neurotic shadows out into the light, and thus help people get rid of them. I'm sorry to say that I couldn't find any equivalent in current Arab or Palestinian literature, but let's face it.
An interesting question which is overlapped with several that you received is, you speak of protagonists and antagonists as though they meant anything in the scheme of the world, whereas in fact isn't Russia the key to success or failure of negotiations in the Middle East?
Yes. Protagonist and antagonist, I have to apologize perhaps for using this literary jargon in a political context. I mean, it's probably an unavoidable tendency with writers. No, I don't think the key lies with Russia. I think Russia did play a very destructive role, but the conflict was there before the Russians. They didn't start it. And I would suggest whoever asks this question or a similar question, not to rely upon this, to me, archaic interpretation, which I mentioned and ascribed to the 20s in Palestine. If only we could stay alone with the Arabs, there would have been no problem. Obviously, the Russians are strong enough to cause more trouble. They may even be there behind another war. But it is not up to the Russians to make peace in the Middle East. It is not even up to an unlikely collaboration of Russia and America to bring peace to them, to bring over peace to the Middle East. They can help, they can promote, they can interrupt, they can destroy. But fundamentally, it's us and the Palestinians in the first place, us and the rest of the Arab world in the second place. This is the crux of the matter. And let's not comfort ourselves by thinking that if only the Russians and the Americans.
One question which really picks up from your last point is, don't you believe that the Palestinian Arabs, at least those on the West Bank, between the 1967 and Yom Kippur War, had adopted a live and let live political attitude that might well have resulted in the gradual steps to world peace, to real peace in the area which you described, but which, for religious, nationalistic, and ethnic intrusion of non-Palestinian Arabs, was once again exploded?
Yes, it is the same question again, and frankly, I was a bitter opponent for those years, during those years, 67 to 73, a bitter opponent of the Golda Meir and Dayan government, not because I ever suspected they are not interested in peace. They were very interested in peace. I blame them for being somewhat unimaginative. Unimaginative in many different ways, but this is one of the ways, really. Those people really believed that if only we promote the Arabs on the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli occupation, grant them with a better standard of living, create an atmosphere of daily cooperation between Israelis and Arabs, this in itself will bring a gradual melting down of the Palestinian identity. It was a move in the right direction. And I admire Dayan for his courage to initiate this policy. But this is not enough. No nation, no national community, no national entity could be satisfied in this crazy world of ours by mere standard of living or financial economical progress. This is not enough. We had a chance, and I think we haven't yet missed it completely. We had the chance during those years to enable the residents of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to vote and elect a national representation, which may have been could indeed be much more extremist to my liking, but I believe it would have been less extremist and less fanatic than the leadership of the PLO. This, to my mind, was an error, and an error which perhaps is not too late to repair.
A question here. Given that the position of the Israeli government, at least officially, is considerably more intransigent than your own, is there any practical possibility of the, quote, simultaneous recognition you speak of?
I think one should listen with great cautiousness and extreme attention to what the Israeli government is really saying nowadays. Rabin is a very cautious and calculating man, and I'm not always very happy about his inner rhythm and about his pragmatism, but eventually he did say some 3 weeks ago in the Knesset that, he put it that way, Israel shall never negotiate with anyone who refuses to recognize its very existence. Now I believe that you, the one who asked the question, as well as some attentive Arab leaders, got the message all right. Israel will not negotiate with anyone who refuses to recognize its right for existence. He didn't say Israel will never negotiate with Palestinians. He didn't even say Israel will never negotiate with the PLO. It is a very calculating and cautious way of putting it, but I think that it is a move in the right direction, and personally I think that this is a move which would have been unthinkable in the days of Dayan and Golda Meir, who tended to ignore the very existence of a Palestinian problem altogether.
This is perhaps a further gloss on your last point, but one questioner asks, in his speech at the UN in answer to Arafat, Ambassador Tekoa said that the Palestinians do have a national state, Jordan. Is this, in your view, an error?
Well, let me say, first of all, that I'm not at all happy about the verbal temperatures of the discussion in the UN. I'm very worried, really, not about the implications of this discussion over the Middle East, but about the implications of this discussion to the future of the UN itself. I mean, I happened to come to America, it's a coincidence, on the same day when Arafat came here, and believe me, the feeling was coming from the midst of a drama straight into the verge of a comedy. And it is true, of course, to come to the point, it is true, of course, that most Palestinian Arabs live in Jordan right now. And most Jordanians at the moment are Palestinian Arabs. But this in itself is not enough to solve the problem. Personally, I would have been very happy if the Palestinians would take over back in 1970, take over Jordan, which would have changed the nature of the conflict into a sort of conventional conflict over territories. In the long range, I'm quite convinced that the Hashemite dynasty is irrelevant. It's not there to stay. It is up to the Jordanians and the Palestinians to decide whether they are going to become one country or two countries. But to me, it is unthinkable that Israel can dominate forever a population of over 1 million Palestinian Arabs who have, many of them have, a sense of national identity. It is disastrous for both parties. It is corrupting for both parties. There is only one thing which is perhaps worse than living under occupation, and it is being the one who occupies. And I have experienced it slightly, really, on my military reserve service, being one of the military governors of an Arab city. It's a dreadful thing. I won't wish it to my worst enemies.
Somebody asks your view of Noam Chomsky's proposal of a binational state. It seems to me you've answered it, but I think it's, for Americans, the kind of question one has to answer again and again.
Yes, I've quite recently read Noam Chomsky's collection of articles, Peace in the Middle East, and let me say that I had the feeling that this book is distorted by a desire for symmetry. He's trying so hard to be symmetrical. Bad Arabs, good Israelis, good Israelis, extremists here, extremists there, moderates here, moderates there. His very concept of moderate Israelis who could perhaps communicate easily with moderate Palestinians on binational state is an absurd to me, because the most moderate Palestinians are those who say that Jews, Christians, and Arabs can live happily in a united Palestine. This is exactly the case as it is put by Israeli extremists. Namely, Jews, Christians, and Arabs could live happily in Israel, full stop. There is no symmetry there is perhaps a symmetry between Arab Palestinian moderates and Israeli extremists, but not the other way around. No, binationalism could have been relevant perhaps back in the 30s. Too much have happened since. Too much hatred and belligerence and emotion has to be cooled down gradually before we can reach any kind of meta-national coexistence.
There was one question here which sufficiently confused, but still is very interesting because it obviously points to the need for you to elaborate something further that you said in your talk. I thought, the question reads, I thought the PLO's offer of a secular state was an appeasement to Jews for the loss of their statehood. That is to say, that Jews living in an Arab state would not be obliged to conform to Muslim law, not that the liberation of Jews would consist in their liberation from their own statehood. Would you comment?
Yes, indeed. Arafat was very explicit and extremely clear about it, for which, in a sense, I'm grateful to him. He said that he is out to liberate the Israelis from the Zionist yoke, from their own ideology, which he regards as racist, fascist, whatever you wish. And as I said, who is he to liberate the Israelis from Zionism? Now, I'm fed up with those arguments about the scenario of a secular Palestine. I once had it in a very strange way, really. In one of very many confrontations, I happened to talk to a Palestinian Arab in London, and he came out with the same idea: why don't we have our own national, united Palestine? Jews, Christians, and Arabs. Let's rid of archaic, murderous nationalist ideologies and have one united Palestine. And I was rather irritating when I said, if it's going to be a democratic state, it's going to be called Israel, and the flag is going to be a flag with a Magen David, and the president will probably be a Jew, and the name of the state will still be Israel, all right, because even if all the Palestinian refugees will come back, there will still be a small Jewish minority, and you claim that you are not going to kick anyone into the sea or throw anyone out of the country. To this, the guy had a very fascinating answer, really. He said, well, but once we get united, and once we have our state, we'll have the most powerful army in the Middle East. We shall be able to conquer Transjordan as well, and then we shall be the majority. Here you are.
Sorry. You want to answer more? You want to go
One
on?
or two more.
You want to go on? Let's take two other questions which also overlapped. There's a question about Michal Shali, a question about the Arab twins forming the one man at the conclusion of the novel, which seems to many almost a paradigm.
Yes. When I've mentioned before the necessity, the inner commitment which I feel as a writer to remove stereotypes, to bring the neurotic shadows out into the light, make them explicit, make them known, make them conscious, make people aware of them. I had in mind, among other works, this novel, My Michael. I thought, although I won't claim that I aimed at it when I wrote the book, I thought that the controversial reaction which it received in Israel was partly due to the fact that I presumably touched upon an open nerve by bringing out into the light a shadow, a devil, a dibuk, which is there.
And I guess the last question, which is undoubtedly the one that underlies many, is a question relating to the prospect of war and the apparent apocalyptic sense, particularly among American Jews, that this war would be the last and that quite conceivably Israel would not be the victor. I wonder whether you could account in some measure for this palpable apocalypticism in non-Israeli Jewry. I would really include the Jewries of Europe as well as the United States in the same predicament, since this kind of thinking turns up today in the English Jewish press and turns up in the European Jewish press as well. I don't think there's any point elaborating the question further, but it runs as a current through many of the questions that we've had tonight.
Are we or are we not going to have another war? I don't know. I say not every Amos is a prophet and not every Oz is related to the Wizard of Oz. But I'm rather worried from what I've experienced in my 6 days in America, really, since I came here on last Wednesday. I'm very worried about traces which are verging on panic among some American Jews. Let me tell you that the atmosphere in Israel itself is perhaps an atmosphere of sad and sober determination. Sad because we have nothing to win, although we are determined to win if we have to fight again. We shall win, I believe, at a very heavy price. We have nothing to gain. We have a whole world to lose, very little to gain. This is sad. Sober because we have very little illusions about one thing, and let me make this point my final point. A nation, any nation, which tries to prevent war at any price is almost sure to get it. And therefore, whatever the price is going to be, however pointless another war is from an Israeli point of view, if there is no other way, we shall fight it. In a sad and sober way, but we shall fight it and we shall win it, pointless as it might be. I wish I could end up with something more cheerful. I wish I could tell you, listen, that's rubbish, nonsense, journalistic balloon, no war is going to occur. I don't know. If it is going to occur, we shall win.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.